Dr. Nathaniel Grant was the kind of man everyone wished lived next door. Mid-40s, neatly dressed, with a calm voice that seemed to dissolve anxiety. He had a presence that commanded respect without demanding it. In the small town of Mapleton, he wasn't just a doctor. He was a symbol of stability, trust, and care. Parents trusted him with their children. Neighbors consulted him for advice on everything from minor illnesses to life's heavier burdens, and the local hospital relied on his judgment in ways few ever questioned. He had the kind of reputation that made people pause before questioning him. Not because they feared him, but because they couldn't imagine him doing anything wrong. For years, Dr. Grant's office was a sanctuary. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, the faint scent of lavender and disinfectant blending into something oddly soothing. Patients often remarked that he made them feel like they were the only person in the world, as if their concerns mattered more than anyone else's. And maybe that was true, at least at first. Among his regular patients was Claire Matthews, a single mother navigating a divorce, struggling to keep her job and care for her 2 children. She came to Dr. Grant after months of persistent migraines and insomnia. The sessions began professionally, medically focused, as one would expect from a highly regarded physician. But over time, the focus shifted. It started subtly. After her appointments, she would receive a text message, "Just checking on you. Hope you're resting." Then came the phone calls in the evening, framed as follow-ups to her health. "I worry about you," he would say. "I know what it's like to feel alone." At first, these gestures felt harmless, even comforting. After all, he was a doctor who cared. But comfort can be a tool in the hands of someone skilled. And Dr. Grant was skilled. Soon, he began asking personal questions about her family life, her struggles, her emotional state. It was framed as concern, as part of a holistic approach to health. But the boundaries started to blur. He would remind her of the nights she had cried alone, recount details she had never shared with anyone else, and position himself as the only one who truly understood. Claire wasn't alone in noticing these subtle shifts. Other patients began receiving similar attention. Late-night texts, personal calls, and emotional intimacy that felt out of place in a doctor-patient relationship. Each one convinced themselves it was benign, that he genuinely cared. After all, no one wanted to doubt a doctor. Yet beneath the veneer of care, a pattern was emerging. Dr. Grant had perfected a system of emotional manipulation. He identified vulnerability, cultivated dependence, and encouraged secrecy, all under the guise of personalized care. Patients began confiding more than they intended, sharing things they would never have told friends or family. He framed their silence as a privilege, a sign of trust, and in doing so, he isolated them from anyone who might notice or intervene. Claire's unease grew. She began documenting every interaction, saving messages, noting details that didn't feel right. One night, after receiving a particularly intimate text, she paused and asked herself the question that no one wants to face. Is this normal? It was the first time she realized she might not be imagining things. Driven by instinct, Claire reached out privately to former patients. At first, no one responded. Then a nurse spoke up. Then another patient. Their stories aligned in a chilling pattern. Personal attention, emotional dependency, secrecy, and a slow erosion of professional boundaries. By the time they connected the dots, the image was undeniable. What felt unique to each patient was actually part of a calculated strategy. Dr. Grant had used his authority and reputation to manipulate multiple people under his care, carefully hiding behind the trust the community had placed in him. Claire, along with several others, presented their findings to the hospital board. Evidence was meticulous: screenshots, journals, timelines of interactions. The board was forced to take action. An independent investigation began. Interviews with patients, staff, and colleagues confirmed the same story. Dr. Grant had exploited the trust of vulnerable individuals in repeated, methodical ways. The revelation shattered the community. Some were devastated, others defensive. Longtime patients questioned themselves. Did I misread the signs? Did I betray my own instincts by trusting him? Families and friends struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the manipulation that had been occurring quietly for years. Dr. Grant resigned quietly, never publicly admitting intent. Counseling programs and support groups were established for patients. The town slowly began to recover, but the trust once placed so freely in a respected figure had been fractured irreparably. And for Claire and the others, the journey didn't end with exposure. It was a long road to reclaim autonomy, rebuild trust in others, and understand the psychological consequences of being manipulated by someone they had once relied on completely. The story of Dr. Nathaniel Grant became more than a cautionary tale. It became a study of how power, authority, and trust can be weaponized, and how courage and vigilance are often the only tools to break a cycle of manipulation. Claire didn't stop with just connecting to former patients. She began piecing together the timeline of Dr. Grant's behavior, looking for patterns he had carefully hidden in plain sight. She discovered that some of his manipulations had started years earlier, long before she ever became his patient. Women who had visited the clinic a decade ago spoke of similar late-night messages, personal confessions, and an emotional intimacy that left them questioning their own instincts. One of them, Lisa Harrow, remembered vividly the first time Dr. Grant had called her at night. She had been struggling with postpartum depression and had confided in him during her visit. That night, the call came, "I know it's hard. I just want to make sure you're okay." At first, she appreciated the concern. But over weeks, the calls became more personal, more frequent. He asked questions about her relationship, her family, her fears, questions no doctor should ask. She eventually stopped answering, feeling a mixture of shame and fear. For years, she had thought it was her fault for trusting him. As Claire gathered more accounts, a chilling pattern emerged. Dr. Grant's methods were systematic. He targeted vulnerable individuals, established trust through professional authority, encouraged secrecy, and slowly created emotional dependence. His reputation shielded him from suspicion. Even the staff who worked closest to him had difficulty imagining that the man they respected could exploit patients in such a calculated way. Claire reached out to Sarah Mitchell, the local journalist, discreetly. Sarah had spent years covering Mapleton politics and local stories, but had never encountered anything quite like this. At first, she was skeptical. Dr. Grant was beloved, well-respected, and seemingly above reproach. But when Claire presented the evidence, Sarah couldn't ignore it. Dates, messages, testimonies, all aligning with a methodical exploitation pattern. The two women decided to approach the hospital board together. The initial reaction was defensive. Administrators struggled to reconcile the glowing reputation of their star physician with the mounting allegations. "Are we sure these claims are accurate?" one board member asked. But the evidence was undeniable. Screenshots of texts, emails, and detailed journals formed a timeline of repeated emotional manipulation spanning years. An independent investigation was launched. Investigators interviewed patients, staff, and colleagues. Many were shocked at first, unable to believe the man they had trusted could behave this way. Others admitted quietly that something had always felt off, but had dismissed their instincts because of his professional stature. Meanwhile, within the community, whispers began to circulate. Patients shared their experiences anonymously at first, fearful of judgment or retaliation. The ripple effect of suspicion and mistrust began to grow. People who had once unquestioningly trusted Dr. Grant began reevaluating past interactions. Friends wondered if private conversations had crossed boundaries. Families questioned whether they had missed subtle signs of emotional exploitation. Among the most affected were Claire's own children. Even though they hadn't been patients, the stress of realizing how deeply their mother had been manipulated took its toll. Sleepless nights, anxiety, and a constant replaying of past interactions became a shared experience for the family. Therapy sessions, both individual and family, became necessary to process the emotional fallout. For the victims, the realization of what had happened was almost worse than the exposure itself. It wasn't physical abuse. There were no criminal actions in the traditional sense, but the psychological manipulation, The erosion of personal boundaries and the exploitation of trust left deep scars. Each victim had to grapple with feelings of shame, self-doubt, and betrayal. How had someone they trusted so completely convinced them to question themselves instead of his intentions? As the investigation continued, more patients came forward. Some were reluctant at first, afraid of judgment or of being blamed. But seeing Claire and others speak out gave them courage. The collective accounts painted a damning portrait. Dr. Grant had repeatedly taken advantage of the power imbalance inherent in the doctor-patient relationship, leveraging trust to manipulate emotionally vulnerable individuals over years. The community's shock was palpable. Town meetings were held to address concerns, reassure citizens, and provide guidance on recognizing emotional exploitation. Local media covered the story carefully, avoiding sensationalism while highlighting the psychological lessons and warning signs for others. The mayor and city officials expressed concern and support for victims, emphasizing that no reputation should shield someone from accountability. Ultimately, Dr. Grant resigned quietly. He never publicly admitted to intentional wrongdoing, maintaining that his actions had always been motivated by care and concern. But to those who had been affected, words could not erase the betrayal. The healing process was slow, requiring counseling, self-reflection, and a renewed understanding of boundaries, trust, and personal autonomy. The story of Dr. Nathaniel Grant became more than just a local scandal. It became a study of authority, trust, and the subtle ways power can be misused. Claire, once a patient struggling to navigate her own vulnerabilities, emerged as a voice for awareness, encouraging others to recognize manipulation before it erodes their sense of self. As the investigation deepened, a clearer picture of Dr. Grant's methods began to emerge. Investigators found that his manipulation was almost surgical in precision. He would carefully study a patient's vulnerabilities, subtly offer emotional support, and frame his attentions as care. Over time, he encouraged patients to isolate their experiences from friends and family, claiming it was a private, sacred trust. By the time someone realized something was wrong, the web of influence and dependency was already well established. One striking discovery was the number of patients who had attempted to distance themselves but were repeatedly drawn back. Emails and messages revealed Dr. Grant's skill at apologizing, at framing concerns as misunderstandings, and at reinforcing the patient's importance to him. This created a psychological loop. Guilt, doubt, and emotional dependence intertwined until the patient questioned their own instincts rather than his behavior. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, spent hours reviewing testimonies and compiling the evidence into a coherent narrative. She spoke with Claire for hours at a time, listening to every detail, ensuring that the story would remain factual, respectful, and centered on the psychological journey of the victims rather than sensationalizing the perpetrator. Each account revealed subtle nuances, a text message that hinted at guilt, a private conversation that blurred personal and professional lines, a moment of misplaced trust that left lasting emotional impact. Meanwhile, the community began to fracture. Patients who had been longtime supporters of Dr. Grant felt anger and betrayal. Others refused to believe the claims, clinging to the image of the kind, compassionate doctor they had always known. Families argued over what they should have noticed. Parents who had referred their children to him wrestled with guilt. Entire social circles were forced to reconsider their assumptions about someone they had admired for years. Claire noticed a pattern among victims. While the methods of manipulation were subtle, the impact was profound. Many suffered in silence, believing they were at fault or that they had misinterpreted the doctor's intentions. Some had even internalized the shame, avoiding medical care or trusting others for fear of being manipulated again. Recognizing this, Claire and the other patients began organizing small support groups to share experiences anonymously, providing each other validation and guidance on reclaiming autonomy and boundaries. One particularly revealing conversation came from a former patient, Rachel Torres. She recounted a series of encounters that initially seemed helpful. Dr. Grant offering guidance during a stressful family crisis, then staying late at the office to provide additional support, then private text messages that escalated to intimate questions about her emotional state. Rachel had initially felt special, important, and chosen, but over time she began to feel trapped by the very attention that had once comforted her. The investigators compiled these accounts alongside documentation from current and former staff. Nurses recalled noticing unusual patterns in Dr. Grant's behavior. Extra time spent with certain patients, requests for private discussions outside office hours, and the occasional observation of patients looking anxious after interactions. None of these incidents alone were damning, but together they revealed a deliberate pattern of boundary crossing. By the time the hospital board released their preliminary report, the community was in shock. Even staff members who had worked closely with Dr. Grant were forced to confront the reality that his conduct, while never physically abusive, constituted emotional exploitation. The report detailed numerous instances where patients' vulnerabilities were leveraged and trust was weaponized for personal influence. Dr. Grant's resignation followed shortly after, quiet and devoid of public admission. He cited personal reasons and the desire to avoid further disruption to the hospital. For the victims, the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing offered some relief, but healing would take much longer. The psychological scars of betrayal, shame, and mistrust lingered, requiring counseling, support, and time to rebuild a sense of safety and autonomy. As the weeks passed, the story gained national attention. It became a focal point for discussions about emotional manipulation in professional settings, the psychological dangers of unchecked authority, and the importance of listening to instincts even when someone seems beyond reproach. Claire, who had been instrumental in bringing the truth to light, became a voice for awareness, speaking carefully about the tactics of manipulation and the importance of maintaining boundaries in relationships of trust. Through it all, the town of Mapleton learned a difficult lesson. Appearances can be deceiving, authority can be misused, and trust, once weaponized, can silence even the most intuitive voices. The exposure of Dr. Grant's pattern did not erase the damage, but it began the process of acknowledgement, accountability, and, for many, the first steps toward reclaiming their lives. The day the hospital released the full findings, the town of Mapleton felt as if it had been split in two. People who had trusted Dr. Grant for years were reeling. Parents who had brought their children to him felt a mix of anger, shame, and disbelief. Neighbors whispered in coffee shops and on front porches, trying to reconcile the man they knew with the manipulator the evidence revealed. For Claire, the exposure brought a complicated sense of relief. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted her for months were replaced by a clarity she had not known before. But clarity didn't erase the emotional turmoil. Nightmares, flashbacks, and the lingering guilt of having trusted someone who had exploited her trust left marks that would take years to fade. The victims who had come forward began attending counseling sessions in groups and individually. Each session revealed layers of trauma that were psychological rather than physical. The deep erosion of boundaries, the betrayal of trust, and the manipulation of their perception of reality. Many spoke of how Dr. Grant had made them feel special, chosen, and understood, only to realize that the very tactics that built that intimacy were part of a pattern of control. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, followed the story closely, but she took care to center the narrative on the victims. She wanted the community to understand not just what Dr. Grant had done, but why it had been so effective, his skill in blending authority, charm, and subtle coercion. The story painted a portrait of a man who had weaponized the very trust that makes doctor-patient relationships sacred. Outside the hospital, the community began grappling with the aftermath. School board meetings, town halls, and small neighborhood gatherings became forums for discussion. People questioned how such behavior could go unnoticed for so long. They debated how to prevent future abuse, how to support victims, and how to recognize the early signs of emotional exploitation. Families who had once been proud to have Dr. Grant as their doctor wrestled with guilt. Had they missed the warning signs? Had they dismissed subtle cues because they didn't want to question someone they respected? These questions lingered in quiet homes, forming the background of Mapleton's uneasy recovery. Meanwhile, Claire and the other victims realized they had a responsibility beyond their own healing. They began organizing awareness sessions and workshops to educate the community about emotional manipulation and boundaries in professional relationships. The work was slow, painstaking, but it gave them a sense of agency, the ability to turn their trauma into a force for prevention. Despite the public exposure, Dr. Grant disappeared from Mapleton quietly. He offered no public apology, no explanation beyond a terse resignation letter. His silence was a final act of control, leaving the narrative unresolved for many, forcing the victims and the community to define their own closure. In the months that followed, Mapleton slowly began to rebuild trust, but it was never the same. Families took extra precautions in choosing healthcare providers. Friends and colleagues became more vigilant in protecting vulnerable individuals. And for Claire, the most profound lesson was personal. That vigilance, intuition, and speaking out are essential tools in preserving one's own sense of autonomy and safety. Dr. Grant's story became a case study in emotional exploitation. It was cited by psychologists, journalists, and legal experts examining the subtle ways authority can be misused. The town, once proud of their trusted physician, became a cautionary tale. Appearances can deceive, trust can be weaponized, and even the most respected figures may conceal secrets that only time, vigilance, and courage can expose. For the victims, life moved forward slowly. Healing wasn't linear, but it was possible. Therapy, community support, and the knowledge that their courage had prevented further manipulation allowed them to reclaim pieces of their lives. The scars remained, invisible but real, a reminder of the power of trust and the importance of protecting it. And for Claire, the final truth settled quietly in her mind. Sometimes, the most profound acts of bravery are the ones that happen in silence, in moments of doubt, when a single voice decides to speak up against a tide of deception. That voice, once raised, can change everything. Even after the dust settled, Mapleton carried the memory of Dr. Grant like a shadow over the town. People no longer assumed that a familiar face automatically meant safety. Conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces often included quiet reminders. Pay attention, trust your instincts, and never ignore your own discomfort. Claire found herself reflecting on how subtle the manipulation had been. It wasn't loud, aggressive, or overt. It was quiet, patient, and methodical. It worked because people wanted to believe in the goodness of others. And for every person who had questioned him, there had been dozens who had defended him, blind to the psychological threads woven into his interactions. She began speaking publicly about her experience, carefully choosing her words to educate without sensationalizing. She spoke about the signs of emotional manipulation, the importance of boundaries, and the need for community vigilance. Slowly, her voice became a beacon for others who had suffered in silence, encouraging them to share their stories and reclaim their autonomy. The victims formed support networks that extended beyond Mapleton, connecting with others across the country who had faced similar experiences. These networks provided validation, guidance, and a framework for understanding the long-term psychological impact of being exploited by someone in authority. Even years later, the lessons of Dr. Grant's actions remained present. The hospital revised its policies, adding stricter safeguards for patient interaction and oversight. Workshops on ethical boundaries, consent, and emotional safety became a regular part of training for staff. The community had learned the hard way that vigilance, documentation, and courage were essential defenses against subtle abuse of power. For Claire, the journey was personal and ongoing. Healing came in increments. A therapy session, a supportive conversation, a moment of self-assurance. She understood now that trust is a fragile thing, and once broken, it takes time and care to rebuild, not just in others, but in oneself. Looking back, she realized that while Dr. Grant had caused harm, the experience had also given her a new perspective on empathy, vigilance, and the courage required to protect both oneself and others. Her voice, once tentative and uncertain, had grown into one of advocacy and awareness. She had transformed trauma into purpose. Mapleton would never forget the story of Dr. Nathaniel Grant, but through that memory, the town learned to question, to observe, and to trust wisely. And for those who had been directly affected, it became a reminder that even in the darkest manipulations, courage, awareness, and speaking out could restore a sense of control and ultimately hope. The lesson was clear. Trust can be misused, authority can conceal danger, but one determined voice, speaking truth and seeking justice, can change everything.